The job seemed simple enough. Watch over an old Victorian house and its two pets while the owners were out of town. As a broke college student, Sophie jumped at the chance to make a quick buck. Mrs. and Mr. Whitmore, the owners, had insisted that their beloved children, a massive black cat named Salem and an eerily quiet parrot named Edgar, needed attentive care. "Don't forget the rules," Mrs. Whitmore said, handing Sophie a handwritten note as they left. Her cryptic smile lingered even as the door shut behind them. The note read, "Feed Salem at exactly 8 p.m. Cover Edgar's cage by 9 p.m. sharp. Do not open the basement door under any circumstances." Sophie shrugged it off. "Rich people and their quirks," she muttered, stuffing the note into her back pocket. The first evening started uneventfully. Salem was aloof, staring at Sophie with piercing green eyes from atop the grand piano in the parlor. Edgar, perched in his ornate golden cage, occasionally muttered phrases in a low, raspy voice that sent shivers down her spine. "Who's there?" and "Not again" were among his favorite utterances. Sophie chalked it up to the bird's training and tried to focus on her studies. At precisely 8 p.m., she poured Salem's food into a crystal bowl, and the cat descended silently like a shadow to eat. By 9 p.m., she draped a heavy velvet cloth over Edgar's cage, ignoring the bird's sudden squawk of protest. "Good night, creepy bird," she whispered, flipping off the light in the living room. The first strange noise came at midnight. Sophie was lying on the plush guest bed when she heard a faint scratching sound. It was coming from downstairs. Probably just Salem, she told herself, though her pulse quickened. Pulling on her hoodie, she crept down the creaking staircase, the house groaning with every step. The scratching grew louder as she approached the living room. Salem sat on the arm of a chair. His back arched, fur bristling. He was staring at the covered cage. "Edgar?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. She pulled the cloth away, revealing the bird perched eerily still, his head cocked to one side. The scratching stopped. Relieved, Sophie replaced the cover and turned to Salem. "Weird, right?" The cat hissed suddenly, leaping off the chair and bolting into the kitchen. The sound startled Sophie, and she spun around to see the basement door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar. Her stomach sank. She distinctly remembered locking it earlier. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing. No answer. Heart pounding, Sophie approached the door and pushed it shut, twisting the key in the lock. As she turned to head back upstairs, she froze. Faint whispers drifted up from the other side of the door. The next day, Sophie tried to shake off her unease. Maybe the house's old pipes were making noises, or the wind was playing tricks on her. Yet she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she wasn't alone. Salem seemed on edge, slinking around the house and glaring at corners as if he could see something Sophie couldn't. Edgar, on the other hand, had grown disturbingly quiet. At 8 p.m., she fed Salem again. As the cat ate, she thought she heard faint footsteps above her. But when she checked, the upstairs hallway was empty. At 9 p.m., she covered Edgar's cage, and the bird let out a low, guttural laugh that made her skin crawl. "Fine," she muttered, turning off the lights. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. Sophie lay frozen in bed as they echoed through the house, mingling with distant thuds and the occasional scraping noise. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself, clutching the covers. But when the basement door creaked open again, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Clutching a flashlight, she tiptoed downstairs. The door was wide open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Cold air wafted up, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. "Hello?" she called, her voice quivering. A soft chuckle echoed from below. Sophie's blood ran cold. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands trembling. As she backed away, she tripped over something soft. Looking down, she saw Salem staring up at her, his eyes glowing in the dim light. The cat let out a low growl, then darted toward the basement door, pawing at it furiously. "No, Salem!" Sophie hissed, scooping him up and retreating to the guest room. She locked the door and sat on the bed, holding the hissing cat as the whispers grew louder. By the third night, Sophie was unraveling. The house seemed alive, its walls creaking and groaning as if they were breathing. The basement door now refused to stay locked, swinging open no matter how many times she secured it. Edgar had started speaking again, repeating phrases in a voice that was no longer his own. "Let them in," he crooned. "They're waiting." Sophie tried to call the Whitmores, but the line crackled with static. Desperate, she considered leaving, but the storm raging outside made it impossible to drive. At 8 p.m., she fed Salem, who ate quickly before darting off, his tail puffed in alarm. At 9 p.m., she covered Edgar's cage, but the bird squawked and thrashed, his voice rising to a deafening pitch. "Quiet!" Sophie screamed, yanking the cover off. Edgar stopped, his beady eyes locking onto hers. In a voice that sounded eerily human, he whispered, "It's too late." The power went out at midnight. Sophie lit a candle, her hands shaking. The whispers were deafening now, accompanied by the sound of footsteps and the occasional chilling laugh. When she heard the basement door slam open, she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with the flashlight and a kitchen knife, she descended the staircase. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers surrounded her, coming from everywhere and nowhere. At the bottom, she found a dirt floor and stone walls lined with shelves of strange, ancient artifacts. In the center of the room stood an ornate mirror, its surface swirling like liquid. Sophie's reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her reflection smiled, even though she hadn't. "Welcome," it whispered, stepping out of the mirror. Sophie screamed as the figure lunged at her. She bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind her. By dawn, the house was silent. The Whitmores returned to find the living room in disarray, the basement door wide open, and Sophie gone. Salem sat on the piano, licking his paw. Edgar croaked, "She let them in," before breaking into eerie laughter. From the mirror in the basement, Sophie's face stared out, her mouth open in a silent scream. When Hannah agreed to pet sit for the Murdochs, it felt like a lucky break. They were paying double the usual rate because it was so last minute, and all she had to do was watch over their golden retriever, Daisy, for the weekend. The Murdochs lived in a quiet, sprawling farmhouse, surrounded by thick woods, a picturesque place that seemed straight out of a postcard. Mr. Murdoch handed her the keys and a handwritten note with instructions before leaving. His voice was calm but firm. "Stick to the rules, okay?" The note read, 1. Feed Daisy at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. 2. Keep all doors locked after sunset. 3. If Daisy barks at the woods, bring her inside immediately. 4. Never go into the barn. Hannah laughed nervously. "You really believe in over-preparation, huh?" Mr. Murdoch's face darkened. "Just follow the rules." The first day went smoothly. Daisy was a sweetheart, her tail wagging furiously whenever Hannah approached. The house was cozy, though the old wooden floors creaked constantly, and the dense woods surrounding the property cast long, eerie shadows. At 7 p.m., Hannah filled Daisy's bowl. As the dog ate, she stared at the back door leading to the yard, growling low. "What's out there, girl?" Hannah asked, glancing outside. The yard was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. She locked the door and drew the curtains, feeling a prickle of unease. That night, Hannah lay awake in the guest room, listening to the strange sounds of the house. The wind howled through the eaves, branches tapped against the windows, and somewhere in the distance there was a faint, rhythmic thumping. She drifted into an uneasy sleep, only to be startled awake by Daisy barking furiously. Hannah rushed downstairs to find the dog standing by the back door, her fur bristling, her bark frantic. The yard beyond was pitch black save for the faint outlines of trees swaying in the wind. "It's okay, Daisy," Hannah said, her voice shaking. She grabbed the dog's collar and pulled her away from the door, locking it tightly. As she led Daisy upstairs, she heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging against wood, coming from the direction of the barn. The next morning, the barn loomed in the distance like a dark, hulking beast. Hannah couldn't shake the sense that something was watching her from its shadowed windows. Daisy seemed fine during the day, playful and affectionate, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, her demeanor changed. She became restless, pacing near the back door, her ears perked as if listening to something Hannah couldn't hear. That night, the barking started again, more frantic than before. This time, Daisy bolted for the door, clawing at it as if desperate to get outside. "Stop it!" Hannah shouted, pulling the dog back, but as she did, she glanced through the window and froze. Something was moving at the edge of the woods. At first, she thought it was a deer, but the shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin. It moved jerkily, like a puppet on strings. And, as it stepped closer, she realized it wasn't walking, it was crawling. Its elongated limbs twisted unnaturally, fingers digging into the dirt as it dragged itself forward. Heart pounding, Hannah yanked the curtains shut and dragged Daisy upstairs. She locked the bedroom door, trembling as the dog whimpered and paced. The next morning, Hannah found deep gouges in the back door, as if something with claws had tried to force its way inside. She called the Murdocks, but the line went straight to voicemail. Panic creeping in, she decided she couldn't stay another night. She began packing her things, but as she stuffed clothes into her bag, Daisy began barking again. This time, it wasn't at the woods, it was at the barn. "No," Hannah whispered, backing away from the window. But Daisy wouldn't stop, her barking growing louder, more desperate. Hannah's curiosity got the better of her. Grabbing the keys from the kitchen counter, she stepped outside, Daisy at her heels. The barn door was heavy and old, its wood warped with age. As she pulled it open, a wave of foul air hit her, and Daisy growled low, refusing to go any further. Inside, the barn was dark, its air thick with the smell of rot. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls, illuminating strange, deep scratches on the wooden beams. In the center of the barn was a large, circular pit, its edges lined with crumbling stones. Hannah's stomach churned. She approached the pit cautiously, peering inside. The darkness was so complete, it seemed to swallow the light. And then something moved. A hand, long, skeletal, and impossibly thin, reached up from the darkness, its fingers curling around the edge of the pit. Hannah screamed and stumbled back, tripping over a broken plank. Daisy barked furiously outside, but the creature didn't emerge. Instead, its head appeared, a pale, eyeless face with a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It let out a low, guttural hiss, and Hannah scrambled to her feet, bolting for the door. She slammed the barn shut, locking it behind her, and raced back to the house. Daisy was already inside, barking wildly at the back door. That night, the scratching at the door was relentless. Hannah sat in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife. Daisy pressed against her leg. At midnight, the whispers started. They came from everywhere at once, a low, chittering sound that made her skin crawl. "Let me in," a voice rasped, so close it felt like it was right next to her ear. She spun around, but no one was there. Daisy growled, staring at the door, and then Hannah heard it. The sound of the barn door creaking open. "No, no, no," she whispered, backing away. The thing from the pit was in the yard now, its grotesque form illuminated by the faint moonlight. It moved faster than before, skittering toward the house on its spindly limbs. Hannah bolted upstairs, dragging Daisy with her. She locked herself in the bathroom, clutching the knife as the whispers grew louder. The house groaned under the weight of the thing climbing the walls. Its claws scraped against the windows, and Hannah could hear its ragged breathing, impossibly close. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, and this time it was coming from inside the room. Hannah turned slowly, the knife trembling in her hand. The mirror above the sink reflected something that wasn't there. A pale, grinning face staring back at her. The last thing she heard was Daisy's frantic barking before everything went dark. When the Murdochs returned, the house was silent. They found the back door torn from its hinges, deep claw marks etched into the floorboards, and Daisy cowering under the kitchen table. Hannah was nowhere to be found. In the barn, the pit was empty, its stones shattered, and the woods seemed darker than ever, as if they were hiding something that had finally been set free. I never considered myself easily scared. Growing up in a rural town, I was used to dark nights, creaky old houses, and eerie woods. But the week I spent pet-sitting for the Ackermans still haunts me to this day. The Ackermans lived on the edge of a sprawling forest in a house that was both beautiful and unnerving. It was old, with tall windows and creaky floors, and the isolation only added to its unsettling charm. Their pets were simple, a friendly Labrador named Max and a shy tabby cat named Cleo. Before leaving, Mrs. Ackerman gave me a few basic rules. 1. Feed Max and Cleo at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. 2. Don't let Cleo outside. 3. Make sure all doors and windows are locked before dark. 4. If you hear scratching at the windows, ignore it. I laughed at the last one, assuming it was some local folklore or a joke. Mrs. Ackerman didn't laugh back. "Just make sure you don't look," she said, her voice low. The first couple of days were uneventful. Max was a joy, following me around the house and wagging his tail at every opportunity. Cleo mostly kept to herself, curling up on windowsills or darting under furniture whenever I got too close. At night, the house took on a different personality. The woods outside seemed to press against the windows, and the creaks of the old house grew louder, almost deliberate. Still, I reminded myself it was just an old building settling. Then, on the third night, I heard it. It was a faint scratching sound, like nails lightly scraping against glass. I froze, my hand hovering over my phone as I scrolled mindlessly in bed. Max, who had been sleeping at the foot of the bed, perked up, his ears twitching. He let out a low growl, staring toward the bedroom window. "It's just a branch," I whispered, more to myself than to him. The scratching grew louder. Max stood, his body tense, a deep rumble building in his chest. My heart raced as I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something, a shadow moving behind the fabric. I clenched the blanket tightly, remembering Mrs. Ackerman's warning. "If you hear scratching at the windows, ignore it." I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening to the scratching until it finally stopped. Max eventually settled down, though his eyes remained fixed on the window for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. I pushed the thought aside and focused on my chores. At 7 a.m., I fed Max and Cleo. Max gobbled up his food enthusiastically, but Cleo was nowhere to be found. I searched the house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. When I finally found her, I wished I hadn't. She was crouched under the dining room table, staring at the back door. Her fur was puffed up, her eyes wide with terror. Following her gaze, I noticed something I hadn't the night before: deep scratches on the glass pane of the door. They weren't the kind of scratches a small animal would leave. These were long, deliberate gouges, as if someone, or something, had been trying to get in. I locked the door and double-checked all the windows, my stomach twisting into knots. That night, the scratching returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. Max growled again, pacing the room as I sat frozen in bed. "Go away," I whispered, clutching my blanket. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, raspy voice, muffled by the glass. "Let me in." I felt tears sting my eyes as I clamped my hands over my ears. Max barked furiously, throwing himself at the window, but I didn't dare move. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." The scratching turned to pounding, the glass rattling in its frame. I was sure it was going to shatter, but then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. The next day, I called the Ackermans, desperate for an explanation. The call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and terrified, I decided to leave, but as I packed my bags, something stopped me. Cleo was sitting by the front door staring at me with unblinking eyes. Her gaze was unnerving, almost accusatory. I couldn't leave her or Max behind, and I told myself I was overreacting. That night, I locked every door and window and kept all the lights on. Max stayed by my side, his tail wagging nervously. Around midnight, the scratching started again. This time, it wasn't just at the window. It came from the back door, the side windows, even the walls. It was everywhere, surrounding the house. Max barked wildly, running from room to room as Cleo hissed and darted under the couch. And then, amidst the chaos, I heard the voice again. "Let me in," it pleaded, the tone desperate now. "Please." I clenched my fists, tears streaming down my face. "Leave me alone," I screamed. The house fell silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, my hands trembling as I made my way down the creaking staircase. Max stayed close to me, his growls low and steady. The back door was wide open, the glass pane shattered. Cold air seeped into the house, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and decay. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The only response was a faint, shuffling sound coming from the living room. I stepped into the room, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The furniture was overturned, the curtains ripped from the windows, and in the corner, crouched on all fours, was a figure. It was humanoid, but impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, its head turned toward me, revealing a pale, featureless face. It tilted its head, as if studying me, then spoke in that same raspy voice. "Let me in." I stumbled back, tripping over an overturned chair. Max lunged at the figure, barking and snapping, but it moved too fast, retreating into the shadows. I didn't wait to see where it went. I grabbed Max and Cleo and ran. I never went back to the Ackermans' house, and I never heard from them again. A few weeks later, I heard a rumor in town. The Ackermans were missing, their house abandoned. Some said they had moved away without a word. Others whispered darker theories. But I know the truth. Whatever was scratching at those windows wasn't just looking to come inside. It was waiting for someone to let it in.